at the risk of betraying my age a bit, I'll probably pay more attention to some of the older type generation models, which, however, I believe are quite foundational and have influenced the way we think and we model economic phenomena. So, in a rough chronological order, I would probably start with Solow's growth model, developed in the mid-50s in a series of papers. The importance of the Solow growth model was, first of all, to essentially transition from the then dominant model, which was the Harrod-Domar model of growth, which emphasized the role of investment and capital formation as the main engine of growth. The beauty of the Solow model is that, and actually that's instructive to economists everywhere, I think, is to focus on assumptions. So if you essentially remove one assumption towards more realism in the Harrod-Domar model and allow some substitutability between factors, Solow demonstrated that actually investment is pretty irrelevant for long-run growth, and the only thing that drives long-run growth is growth in the long run is productivity growth, or and this has had a lot of, this paper is important because it has had a lot of influence in the literature on growth itself. It has generated very large literature that, for example, in the direction of growth accounting, identifying the main determinants of growth in particular countries from a quantitative perspective. Solow himself contributed to that. And also, once people started introducing a more detailed analysis of consumer behavior in the context of the growth model, you come up with the so-called golden rule theory of Phelps, etc. But its influence extends beyond growth itself. The Solow growth model is a bit transposed to shorter run analysis, and it's an essential ingredient of real business cycle models that developed many decades, some decades after the Solow contribution, and also it's an important part of any macro model, frankly, that we are using on a routine basis. Secondly, I want to mention two separate papers, but it's the same type of theory. It's the Modigliani life cycle theory of consumption and the Friedman permanent income hypothesis. They're about the same, essentially they're the same model, or two sides of the same, of looking at the same thing. What's important, again, first of all, it came in response to a kind of theoretical puzzle that was becoming more and more apparent. The typical way that people would model back then was to use a simple Keynesian consumption function with a constant term and a constant marginal propensity to consume out of income. What became apparent when people started to empirically apply this is that over a long period of time, the average propensity to consume turned out to be constant rather than declining as income grew. So they were motivated by this, but of course the importance is much more than trying to find a fix for this. They had to rethink the whole consumption behavior of households from an explicitly optimizing lifetime intertemporal optimization perspective, and develop something that was much more satisfactory theoretically and could be justified much better on that basis. Again, I mean, it's important. I mean, these two contributions are important because they had tremendous influence in model building and in our way of thinking about macroeconomics up to now. Really, it has been essential, for example, in developing the new theories of international macro. The Obstfeld-Rogoff model is essentially an application of the permanent income life cycle model to the open economy, and that's how they get optimal consumption behavior and hence the equilibrium path of the current account over time. It's been used also in, I mean, again, it's part of, it's become part and parcel of any standard macro model these days. It can be used in the analysis of fiscal policy from a longer term point of view in terms of fiscal sustainability. It's an important ingredient. So I think it's an indispensable type of model. As a fourth paper, I would pick Samuelson's overlapping generation model that was developed, that was published, I believe, in 1958. So I'm still in early stages here. That's an extremely beautiful model, first of all. It was the first time that the overlapping generations framework was introduced, which, again, methodologically has made a huge, has been exploited in almost all directions in macro. But it's used it's not just the methodology part of it, but it's what you want to demonstrate, and that's the beauty of it. It's an extremely simple model, but what he tries to demonstrate is the importance of nominal assets in determining real equilibrium in economy. I mean, essentially, it's a way to demonstrate the importance of missing markets if nominal assets are not there. So you have two generations, a working generation and a retired generation. If you have no nominal asset, money or any other nominal asset that can be used as a medium of exchange and a store of value, then essentially there can be no trade between the retired generation, which produces nothing, and the next generation of workers of working age folk. What that does essentially is that even if the economy is growing over time due to productivity or whatever other factor, the equilibrium interest rate in this economy is zero, just because you break you essentially have a missing market there. So once you introduce the money or another nominal asset into this framework, you get a more natural type of real interest rate, which is set at the growth rate of the economy, or depending how the model is specified. So this is a stark conclusion, right? The fact by introducing a nominal asset in this framework can change a fundamental real equilibrium variable. Because before it was this idea of the classical dichotomy where nominal variables could not affect real outcomes in the long run, at least. This is a long run real effect of having a nominal asset. So I think it's important both for its modeling, for the idea that it captures with a very simple model, and also methodologically, of course, the use of the overlapping generation framework has been quite extensive. Now I think I'm going to move on a bit more recently to the 1960s, which is also almost the beginning of my own lifetime. I think an important paper is Friedman's presidential address, I believe in 1968, and where he formalizes for the first time, of course, these ideas he had developed before of the natural rate of unemployment, and the fact that the Phillips curve trade-off that could be a short-run relation could not be exploited in the long run, and so trying to stimulate the economy through inflation, even if it may work in the short run. In Friedman's framework, he uses adaptive expectations, and therefore there is some exploitable short run trade-off there. Over longer periods, it cannot be exploited to affect real income and employment. And if policymakers try to exploit it and push unemployment below the natural rate, what you get is an acceleration of inflation, rather than having a permanent impact on unemployment. I think the natural rate hypothesis is now a standard ingredient in almost all models, whether not just the monetarist models of Friedman's liking, but also the new Keynesian model. It incorporates the natural rate hypothesis as an essential ingredient. What next? I would, moving a decade later, I would probably go to, in a way related to Friedman's natural rate model. I would pick the Lucas so-called islands model, which is, in terms of intuition, is essentially it indicates that once you include rational expectations as the way of expectations formation, the Phillips curve is not exploitable even in the short run. So it's sort of a more dramatic result in terms of this particular result. Probably has not stood the test of time. Even Lucas himself at some point acknowledged that there is some degree of stickiness and other frictions in the economy that do not allow short-run adjustment to equilibrium this fast. So, but even if this particular result is not probably did not hold for a long time, or was not considered seriously for a long time, the methodology and the other intuitions of this particular way of modeling expectations formation and information diffusion in an economy is still very much important and very much used. I mean, the idea that I mean, he used the islands metaphor to characterize markets that are segmented, so that information is never perfect. Economic agents have their own private information, but may not be able to observe aggregate variables. This is a particularly, I think, important intuition that has guided and helped influence the way people now think about issues of communication of monetary policy, how private information interacts with the central bank's information, for example, and what types of outcomes might result from this interaction. Moving along, I would pick a very different model, the Dornbusch overshooting model of the mid-70s. Why is that important? It's important, first of all, because it's a very different way of modeling relative to the types of DSG type models that we have grown very used to today. It's a different way, it's a different concept of modeling. I would call this the MIT type modeling, where a model is not assumed to describe everything, but it's used as a formalization, as a way to formalize a particular intuition. A little bit like the overlapping generations model of Samuelson that we referred to before. Essentially what it does, it shows how, remember, this was, first of all, to put it in some context and why it was important to be developed this way. This came shortly after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, the beginning of floating. People observed a lot more variability in both nominal and real exchange rates that could be explained by models so far. People expected that the evolution of exchange rates would be much more stable than what they observed right after the system of the fixed exchange rates was let go. And so it came to provide some intuition of why this should be the case, and he did it in a very simple modeling framework. Essentially, that was also when rational expectations were coming into the picture, were being discussed. So essentially, he said that if goods markets and assets markets behave in a different way, you may get not a smooth convergence of the exchange rate to equilibrium, but very large fluctuations. All he needed to do is to assume that asset prices clear very quickly, very fast, almost instantaneously in his particular model, but goods market take a much longer time to clear, because there are frictions, rigidities, frictions in adjusting investment levels to desired levels, and therefore it may take some time. Just this difference in adjustment speeds generates his famous overshooting, where the exchange rate initially may overshoot its equilibrium before getting back towards it, and thus explain these fluctuations. Again, a very simple modeling, very MIT style, simple modeling, but to capture some essential intuition, not to tell you that this is how the world works, but to formalize an idea why you can explain an economic puzzle, why there was such a big degree of fluctuation in nominal and real exchange rates. Moving along, maybe actually going a bit earlier in time, back to the 60s. I would pick. Doug reminded me that I have to pick a paper by my advisor James Tobin. There are many, a long series of papers on his so-called general equilibrium asset pricing models that he was using. If I were to pick one, which probably is one of the original ones and one of the influential ones, is the model he did with Brainerd by looking at money and capital as two different types of assets, and see how the analysis of traditional policies may change if you incorporate capital directly as an alternative asset. In general, the overall idea is that you have a wide variety of assets out there, and the main difference with the DSG model is that they cannot be lumped together. They are not perfect substitutes, but in fact they are imperfect substitutes. It's this imperfect substitutability that changes the way that the macro adjustment and the transmission mechanism occurs in these models. I mean, this is a model that has been referred to extensively. it generates as a conclusion, among other things, the so-called Q theory of investment, which has some influence, but its main importance is to essentially put into question the idea of reducing monetary policy to a change in the interest rate. In this particular type of modeling, the monetary policy is a much richer type of process, where relative changes in the relative supplies of assets would change would constitute monetary policy in effect. Methodologically, it's also important because back then the way Keynesian macro was taught is to have the IS and the LM curves. Of course, if you put money as an imperfect substitute for capital, the independence between the IS and LM curves breaks down. You can no longer think of the economy as an IS-LM model, because once you put changing the relative supply of money into the model affecting capital accumulation in the short run, it would shift the IS curve. So a monetary shock or a change in the relative supply of bonds or any other assets would shift the IS curve, which was not built into. That contradicts the kind of independence of IS and LM that was used typically. Where am I now? 8?
You have 2 left.
I have 2 left. Okay, as my 9th model, I would.
So you don't have anything from the 1980s. You don't have anything.
Okay,
from the
let's go to the 1980s.
And you've got nothing from the last.
Okay, let's go to the 1980s. Let me jump to the 1980s.
You don't have to jump if you don't want to, right?
and pick a real business cycle model. I would pick the Kydland-Prescott time to build model. Again, this is sort of an offspring of the rational expectations revolution. It builds onto this tradition by having market clearing and rational expectations formation, but it does more than that. Essentially, it shows how the importance of real shocks in governing in driving the business cycle, driving real fluctuations. This had been somewhat neglected in the past. People just thought of monetary shocks, or the analysis had focused more on monetary shocks, so that was an important complement, at least, of business cycle analysis. I think it reached a bit. Also, actually, it in a very strange way, it fit a bit into the older Keynesian monetarist debates, where the question was whether the evolution of nominal income could be explained mainly by monetary factors, or whether real factors such as fiscal policy or other real shocks had more importance. This was the more of a 60s type of debate, but once you introduced money into these real business cycle models, it showed that you could get money-income correlations even if the only source of underlying fluctuations were real shocks. So that this whole debate about testing the monetarist model, for example, by finding strong nominal income money correlations may not have been relevant. In fact, as an aside, Prescott once told me that he didn't realize why my advisor James Tobin was so opposed to these models, because he said actually that he had developed the first real business cycle model himself in the 1960s in a Journal of Money, Credit and Banking paper, where again, there the debate was between whether fiscal or monetary drives things, and he developed actually a model of real shocks where you still had a very strong money-income correlation without being any causality from one to the other. Now, the importance, going beyond that, the importance, of course, of real business cycle models is that even if the very strong presumption of these models that you could explain all of real fluctuations by productivity, by real shocks, productivity or tastes, etc., this has not stood the test of time. But still, the real business cycle model, by incorporating these types of shocks into the analysis, is an essential ingredient of the DSG model or any other standard macro models. Essentially, it filled a gap that had not been developed extensively. And since Doug here is telling me that I may be looking too much to the past, let me point to a rather recent model, which is the Caballero-Krishnamurthy model of safe assets. Now, Caballero was a student of Dornbusch's, so it's not accidental that his way of modeling resembles this MIT type modeling. Again, they are not overwhelming total economy models, but they are trying to explain something, a specific question, in a way that allows them to go much more deeply into the substance of the question. Again, this came as an answer to puzzles of more recent years. In particular, it came as a complementary way, essentially, to address some limits to Bernanke's savings glut hypothesis, which could explain some things but left some other important aspects unexplained. Since then, the concept of safe assets, and in particular the problem of a shortage of safe assets, is something that has generated a whole lot of interest and a whole lot of research. It has obvious policy implications, because if your assets are limited, then safe assets are limited, then you could get some very ugly equilibria out there, and possibility of crisis being much more deep than otherwise. And also, in a sense, it brings us back to the Tobin type tradition of paying much more attention to assets markets and the interactions with the real economy than had been done until now. So this is my list of 10 here.
Well, that was very interesting. It's amazing it took so long to get a Tobin a paper out of somebody that studied under James Tobin. I think I was going to characterize Tobin in this group of people. He wasn't afraid of the messy stuff and the stuff that we're actually still wrestling with to this day.
Yeah.
Okay?
In effect, something that I might have mentioned, in a Tobin type framework, you could get at least an explanation of the effectiveness of the most recent QE policies, right? QE policies. I mean, Bernanke famously said at some point that we can explain, we can understand the effectiveness of QE in practice, but not in theory, in the sense that the workhorse DSG models left very little room to explain why changing supplies of assets and demands of assets would have a monetary impact. Of course, this is very natural in a Tobin style model.